Picture this. You're sitting in a packed classroom. The professor walks in, points directly at a student in the front row, and just harshly orders them to get out. The student, totally embarrassed and completely confused, packs up their bag and leaves. So what do? What does the rest of the class do? Well, in almost every single instance of this social experiment, the room just sits there in absolute silence. No one says a word. Then the professor turns to the remaining students and asks a really piercing question. Why didn't anyone object? You see, this exercise isn't actually about that one dismissed student at all. It's about us. It's a pretty striking demonstration of how quickly we just abandon our own internal sense of justice and tolerate unfairness the exact moment authority enters the room.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to deconstruct exactly how that kind of silence happens, but on a massive societal scale. We'll be looking at the nuts and bolts of crisis politics, how leaders use threat framing to govern, and the deep psychological architecture of silence that actually allows these strategies to succeed. So if you've ever wanted to understand how norms shift right under our noses and how we can actually push back, you are definitely in the right place. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Crisis Politics Playbook, look at emotion over structural policy, and trace historical patterns of populism. Then we'll dive into the architecture of silence, before wrapping up with a blueprint for courage. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Crisis Politics Playbook. To really understand how fear and chaos are used as a strategy, we can look at the political style of Donald Trump. Political scientists point out that his approach heavily relies on turning conflict itself into an actual governing tool. And the mechanics of this form a super clear 5-step pattern. First, you identify a threat. Second, you manufacture a sense of absolute immediate urgency around it. Third, you frame your opponents as part of that threat, creating a really rigid us versus them dynamic. Fourth, you step up and present yourself as the one and only solution. And finally, you mobilize your loyal supporters around all that outrage. Basically, this keeps the public laser-focused on the crisis rather than actual, boring policy. Now, we need to be rigorously analytical here and look at how this exact same rhetoric gets interpreted in two wildly different ways. Critics, on one hand, view this threat framing as a deliberate strategy, a way to intimidate opponents, hijack the news cycle, and consolidate power. But supporters, they look at the exact same messaging and see something entirely different. They see a candid, refreshing recognition of real, urgent problems that traditional political elites have just ignored for years. But hey, regardless of the interpretation, the underlying mechanism, mobilizing a base through perceived threat, remains exactly the same. Moving on to Section 2, emotion over structural policy. You might be wondering, why are these emotional appeals so overwhelmingly effective? Well, simply put, fear is politically sticky. When people perceive a genuine threat, our brains are psychologically wired to demand decisive action right now. So when the national debate is entirely consumed by a dramatic border confrontation or the latest cultural controversy, it completely dominates the news cycle. And what happens? That outrage crowds out everything else. It completely shifts our attention away from much deeper institutional structural problems. Huge issues like wealth inequality, broken healthcare systems, housing affordability, and long-term economic trends, they literally just get pushed to the background. Which brings us to Section 3. Historical patterns of populism. Now, it's really important to zoom out for a second. While we've been using recent American politics as our main case study, turning conflict into a governing tool, that is not a modern anomaly, not even close. Political scientists have identified this exact same architecture of chaos across decades, across entirely different countries, and across all kinds of ideologies. We're talking from Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in the US, to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, to Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. This whole us versus them crisis rhetoric functions as a highly recognizable and honestly highly effective governing method across the entire political spectrum. Let's look at Section 4, the architecture of silence. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the macro political strategy, but why do populations actually go along with this? Why do we all retreat into this complicit silence? Well, at the heart of it is a fascinating psychological dynamic called pluralistic ignorance. This happens when you privately harbor deep concerns about a situation, say a glaring injustice at work or the politicization of a government agency, but you don't say a word. Why? Because you incorrectly assume that everyone else is totally fine with it.
You perform this rapid internal risk calculus, weighing the social cost of speaking up against the unfairness you're seeing. And because you feel isolated, that cost seems astronomically high. This is exactly how high-conflict political strategies gain so much traction with the public. And that dynamic brings us right to the resulting behavior, which you've probably heard of, the bystander effect. Because of pluralistic ignorance, everyone is looking around the room at everyone else for a cue on how to react. And what do they see? Nothing, just silence. So, the entire group concludes that no action is necessary, even when a blatant violation of fairness is happening right in front of their eyes. The truly tragic irony here is that the silence of the room gradually establishes a brand new, much lower democratic norm for everyone. There's this incredibly powerful quote from our source material that perfectly captures this. When we remain silent in the face of unfairness, we are not neutral observers. We are teaching everyone around us what behavior is acceptable. You see, democracies rarely just disappear overnight. Instead, the whole process begins with rationalizations. We tell ourselves things like, well, it doesn't really affect me, or I'm not informed enough to say anything, or I'm sure someone else is going to speak up. But those rationalizations gradually erode our democratic culture, inch by inch, until the injustice finally reaches your own front door.
And finally, Section 5, a blueprint for courage. We are absolutely not going to leave you hanging with just the problem. So, how do we actually break this architecture of silence? Well, here is a practical, evidence-based blueprint for intervention. Step 1, act early and clearly. Norms are established by what we allow to pass without a challenge. Speaking up the very first time a standard is breached is just vastly more effective than waiting until silence becomes the established rule. Steps 2 through 5 are all about precision and documentation, which we'll unpack in just a second. And step 6 is vital: build coalitions. Collective action completely shatters pluralistic ignorance because it proves to the people around you that they aren't actually alone in their concerns. Now, when it comes to challenging power, your moral intuition alone just isn't going to cut it. You absolutely must anchor your arguments in verifiable evidence. That means bringing the receipts, using primary sources like court records, legal filings, and memos, rather than relying on secondhand narratives. It means consciously avoiding inflammatory rhetoric and loaded terms. A highly effective tactic here is to name the specific behavior, not the person. For example, say something like, "This policy expands warrantless search," rather than attacking a politician's character. Describe the measurable effects. Doing this separates hard fact from partisan noise and makes your challenge undeniable. We've covered a ton of ground today, moving from the massive macro strategies of crisis politics all the way down to the micro level of our own personal silence in a room. I want to leave you with one last profound thought from our source material. A culture of courage is built long before courage is required. Ultimately, justice and freedom only survive when ordinary citizens are willing to stand up and defend those principles, long before they personally become the victims. So the question isn't whether something happens to be your fight right now, in this exact moment. The real question is, what kind of society do we create when everyone decides it isn't? I challenge you to take these civic tools, recognize the silence in the room the next time you hear it, and choose not to look away. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.